What's up, gamers? Welcome to episode 38 of the Business Casual Gamers podcast. This is the show focused on gamers with jobs, families who have things to do in real life. My name is Chris Smoke, and as always, I am alongside my co-host, Mr. Aaron Connick. Aaron, how are you doing today?
I am great, Chris. Ready to talk about some sadness.
We love sadness here on the Business Casual Gamers. I really think that this will be an amazing show, but before we get into that, you know what's coming first. We need to talk about how to connect with us. You can find us on our website at businesscasualgamers.com. As always, you can find us on iTunes. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter at BISCasualGamers. You can also find us on the Googles and all sorts of other things like the Stitchers. We are also there as well.
We're there.
Please take the time, if you don't mind, to go on iTunes, go on your favorite podcasting source, and leave us a review, please. Leave us a review. We have a couple people who have already accepted our bribe, Aaron's bribe.
I pay in games, people.
He pays in games.
If you listen to this show, I know you play video games. Why not get paid in the currency of your choice? Video games. Take advantage of it.
He might, if you don't, you know what? If you don't take him up on the offer, he might send you Child of Light. Not Child of Light. What's the other one?
Child of Eden.
Child of Eden. Equally, actually,
awesome.
Also terrible game.
Awesome game.
He might send you that, and then you're going to be forced to burn it in effigy, and that would be bad. So, please take your time to do that for us. Of course, we're keep all the reviews coming for all of the things that we're doing in our assignment segment at the end of the show, so you'll hear that. And please, if you need to get a hold of us, you can email me at chris@businesscasualgamers.com to accept some of those bribes that we have there. Now, Aaron, this is a really good topic, I think. I'm excited about this one. As you mentioned, it's about sadness, and that's probably our favorite topic to talk about here, even though we probably haven't done an episode on it before. What are we going to talk about today, specifically?
Yeah, so for our BCG discussion topic of the week, Chris and I, certainly over the last 12 months, over the entirety of the course of this show, we've dealt with some games that have disappointed us, frankly.
No, not one.
No.
One.
We've had a couple, and for longtime listeners of the show, you've heard us describe them, and you've heard the jubilation and the excitement and the anticipation. You slowly morph into sadness and crushing disappointment at times.
Kind of like a Child of Eden that you thought was actually good beforehand.
Oh, worse than that, Chris. That at least was like a 1 hour investment of time for you. I have invested 4 more times into far less useful endeavors this year. Now, what we want to talk about, anybody who's been in the hobby for a long time, whether it's going back to that game you saved up your allowance for when you were a kid and only to realize that it was a $60 piece of garbage, or to have the game that was in development for years that we'll transition into shortly that came out the other end and you say, what happened or what got left on the cutting room floor? Those things happen. And if you're going to stick with the hobby for any significant amount of time, you're going to experience some disappointment that at times, honestly, could shake you to the point where you just say, you know what, I'm done with this. Forget it. Yeah. I don't want to deal with it. I have invested too much time into this, and it's time to just do something else. So on today's show, we really want to explore some different variations and examples of disappointment games and just give you some thoughts on how we've dealt with it, maybe our reaction to it, and how we move forward. Because I do think that is an important part of staying with the hobby is you got to get back on the saddle, because the next great game, honestly, over the course of our lifetime, is always around the corner. But if you're not willing to kind of take your licks and go with it, it is very easy to get disenfranchised and be that internet troll that finds themselves on Metacritic leaving 0 reader reviews and saying, this is the worst thing ever. I now stalk this developer outside of his house on a daily basis.
So you're saying the answer is not to kick a hole in the wall and rage sell the game?
No, it is not. It is not. I may have rage sold a game recently, but I did not kick a hole in the wall in the process.
Neither did I,
so
thankfully.
Half of that may be acceptable. But Chris, what I want to break this show into a couple different segments. So we're going to start with talking about the game that doesn't live up to expectations. We're going to transition into what about if maybe the game lived up to your expectations in terms of what it was designed to do, but it just has crushing bugs or performance issues, and it just mars the overall experience, even if the design was there. And then we're going to transition into, what if I just suck at this game, or it's just too hard?
Yeah.
And even though what is there is great, I am just not willing to invest the time to get to the good stuff. Or even if I invest the time, I may never get there. So those are going to be kind of the different facets of disappointment that we go into. But Chris, let's start with one that we talked about, which is when a franchise doesn't live up to expectations. And I want to get your thoughts on this first, because Chris, when we made a Hall of Fame entrant in the form of Final Fantasy VI some episodes ago,
Yep.
we all acknowledge an amazing game, really kind of at one of those life-changing games for both of us. We compare that to what we played in the past year, Final Fantasy 15. You were very skeptical. I was also skeptical, but I would say probably leaned more into I think they're going to get there. I'm excited towards the end. But I think that we both experienced a lot of disappointment. Chris, talk me through kind of your process, even though we chronicled a little bit of it on the show, with some time behind us. Give me kind of the retrospective of your emotions as you played through further and further.
Oh my gosh! Now, this is a roller coaster, I think. Really, I mean, because we anyone who's listened to the show certainly late last year had heard us kind of banter back and forth about how the broness of the game and how I thought it was going to be terrible, and I realistically, as we got closer to the game's release, I thought that, okay, maybe they are going to pull this thing off. Maybe it was going to be pretty good. And initially when I saw some reviews come back, it seemed like it was a really interesting and compelling game. So, I had very low expectations initially, so it's kind of hard to let me down at that point. But when I started playing the game, I think it was better than I expected, at least initially. And this is where it kind of starts coming off the rails. So the initial maybe 2 to 5 hours or 6 hours or so, was really interesting. It really felt fun. Like we had some of we talked a little bit earlier about the broisms and some of the going back and forth that I think was really fun and interesting. The combat was, I think, a little bit janky in some areas, certain dungeons and things, but it was still pretty fun and passable. But then we quickly started getting into, I didn't even make it nearly as far as you. I was maybe 10 or 15 hours in total when I started getting to the point where, we saw those drops from those enemies that like, literally it's like every 2 minutes I try to turn around and those stupid ships are coming down and like 5,000 enemies pour out. And then I'm like, I have to go through and fight those things again. Those things started getting on my nerves. And that's really what started to hit the disappointment curve for me. I was interested in the story, and I wanted to continue moving along in that story, and I was kind of, even that early in the game, there are many, many questions to be answered. Yeah. And I got to the point where I was just beaten down by the fact that there are so many of these ridiculous battles that I didn't feel like I was getting anything out of, and I knew that if I was going from here to some other point later on, I didn't have a car at the time in the story. I knew if I was going to do this, it was going to take me so much time, and I started kind of losing faith in the mechanics and the overall, I'm not even saying the story elements, but just the enemy elements that kind of lost the story favor for me, and I put it to sleep. I have not played it since that day last year.
Now let me ask you this, and I'll give you my take in a second, but you've obviously been a lifelong franchise fan. You've played it since literally the first Final Fantasy. This has been a part of your entire life. How do you take the next step? Are you done with the franchise at this point, or how do you continue your relationship with Final Fantasy, so to speak?
It's a good question. I don't know. I have, I'm one of those interesting RPG players, JRPG players that really likes, I know a lot of people dislike this, but I really like the turn-based battle system. I like those kinds of games. Like I'm playing Dragon Quest VIII again, on my 3DS and in my spare time, because I love those kinds of things. So when you get to, Final Fantasy VIII was actually maybe 9 or 10, 10-2 or whatever. They're only the ones where they started kind of, they were tweaking the battle system, but it was still very much turn-based.
Sure.
Beyond that, when we started getting into the newer systems in later games, and certainly this game is another one, where the battle system just seems like it's too much of an action-y, but it also can't. They also want to try to root it in fundamental RPG elements. And it just, in my mind, it starts to water down and lose its overall value. If I want an action game, I'll play an action game, and I like those. But if I want an RPG, I want the RPG components. It's honestly probably why I liked I Am Setsuna so much for where it was, because it's still very tied in, very simple, mechanics, and they have a little bit of flair here and there that makes it kind of fun. A little bit of a twitch to the perspective, I guess. But, that's where I started kind of doing it. And so when I think about where it's moving, I don't know. I can't disagree with them because I believe I'm in the minority when it comes to wanting that old school experience. And I think that maybe the old school experience that I'm going to get will be from the Tokyo RPG Factory, as we talked about before. So
New game announced, by the way.
New game announced, by the way.
Check Twitter.
And I think that's really interesting. It looks almost exactly like I Am Setsuna. I'll actually still play it, though, because I think that's just what I want. And like I said before, I don't think that there's going to be a big market for that. For me, I think that the Final Fantasy is, I reluctantly went into Final Fantasy 15. Yeah. Honestly, I did it because I wanted to give it a try. You were so into it, and a lot of people were, and I thought that there was something to be gained from my perspective in talking about it, the podcast with the audience, those kinds of things. I don't know that I'm going to play another Final Fantasy, honestly.
Well, let me tell you, I'll preface this by saying I'm going to reveal a spoiler, but it really is so inconsequential that I don't even care to spoil. I'm just going to drop that casually. So I have almost finished the game. I'm at the last boss. And the interesting thing, so I've gone through multiple phases. So beginning of the game where you have bros, open world exploration, and new action-oriented battle system, I was in. I thought that they did an excellent job on all of the above. There's some quirks. We talked about the dialogues. There's some things. But all in all, I was having a great time. As I've progressed further through what I'll call the main plot line here is the overall, what I felt to be the driving story, it started feeling rushed. And it started feeling increasingly like, let's spend a little bit more time on this. I'm not quite sure I'm ready to leave this yet. And I kept feeling hurried through the game. And I come, as we've talked about on the show, I come to Final Fantasy primarily for the story. And once you ground the game in a story and characters that I'm really interested in, then the mechanics are like the icing on the cake, and I really get into that, and I'm very interested. And that's what kind of keeps me going through the game. But if you never get me bought in on the story or the quest or the characters, I can't really truly appreciate all the other stuff. So as the game goes on, so Luna Freya was a character. It's basically, she is the love interest that you're trying to marry. And you're waiting for this time where you actually meet her. Now, I think they did an amazing job animating her. It kind of built this anticipation of, I really want to see this relationship unfold. So you finally meet her in person, and literally within 10 minutes of meeting her, with very little outside backstory on her, they have a scene that is basically a carbon copy of Final Fantasy VII, where Arden, I'm pretty sure that I'm saying his name right, but he's so forgettable too that the last boss is actually a forgettable character whose name I can barely remember. It is basically a recreation of the scene where Aerith gets stabbed, where instead of a long, 20-foot katana, he takes a knife and stabs Luna Freya, and she dies. And this is supposed to be, and I will say, the scene is beautifully animated, the music's great, but I just sat there and I said, I don't know Luna Freya. I have no emotional connection, and I don't really even have any emotional connection to my character. And so it fell so flat, and it gets worse because all these characters you just know nothing about, to where I'm just trudging through the game, and I just feel like there are so many glaring plot holes that I just can't stomach it. But I will say, what I realized later in the game is that they didn't make a story game. What they actually made is, in their mind, and I would argue they may have succeeded at this, the best version of Monster Hunter that's been made today. I honestly think, Chris, that if I wish that I would just get the design document, that at some point, I think they just said, we have a story that is going to take years more of development to get the assets and the voice acting and all this to flesh a real story out at this quality level. But what we do have is we have a cool battle system. It looks great. We have big enemies. It's splashy. We have a cool skill system. Let's just give them a better Monster Hunter. Japanese people like Monster Hunter. That game's a hit. Let's just release Monster Hunter, and maybe we'll fill in some of the story holes later.
Well, let's pull the thread on that, actually, because not to get too far off topic, but it's interesting because Final Fantasy 15 had that Kingsglaive movie and all the anime and all that other stuff, the comic, whatever, the manga, whatever was around it, that I think going in right before I started the game, I heard people say that if you really want to understand the story and really get it, you need to watch Kingsglaive first. And you need to go do all the mangas and all that stuff. So you've watched all that.
I
own
Kingsglaive, and it does fill a lot of the holes. But then you just say, did they sell me an incomplete game? Which we talked about in another episode.
Yeah.
But I think this is where I kind of went back, and after going through the end, I just said, you know what? I could look at this two ways. I could either say, this is not the Final Fantasy I wanted, in the sense that they really abandoned ship on story in a way that I'm not comfortable with. Or I can just say, pretend like Final Fantasy Versus 13 or whatever it was called way back when. Pretend that game really was vaporware and it never came out. And let's just say that this was not called Final Fantasy 15 and it was just released as another Square Enix title and another franchise. And it was, hey, this is our answer to Monster Hunter. I actually think I would have felt different about the game.
Really?
And I like it better than Monster Hunter. And I will say, when I just went back to doing like the mob quests where you're doing hunts, I was having fun again. And it's better late game than it is early game. And I just said, maybe I just need to forget it and say they completely failed from a storytelling standpoint. But what's left, if I just stop playing, like I'm done with the main quest now. If I stop caring about the story, I got a cool game that I'm left with. And that's something that as a player, I'm trying to kind of look for those glimmers of hope to say, it wasn't what I wanted, but maybe there's enough here to just say, I'll appreciate what they made and go in with different expectations next time.
I can see that. And that's interesting to hear you say that, because I feel like, I don't know. I'm glad that you can get excitement out of and enjoyment out of a game that, you know, was obviously meant to be a tear-jerking kind of a story, right? They put so much effort into this overall story and the Kingsglaive and the entire world surrounding it that I'm sure it would make them feel really horrible to hear that you and or people and people that agree with you really just think that they whiffed on the story, and that's it's sad. I think I would argue it's probably hard to please everyone, number one, but it is cool that you can find those kinds of ancillary things to really enjoy in the game, and I've had various experiences like that as well. But for me, it's funny because I just don't. I don't really care about the story at all either. I mean, I kind of want to understand what happens a little bit because they were just starting to tease the story. So I didn't even get the chance to see it become anything, start to bloom, only to get like destroyed. But I did, I've gone on a couple hunts and where I was, and I think that the hunts were actually very fun. I don't know. I've never played Monster Hunter games before this, though, so I don't know if I would be personally very compelled by it long term. I just think that in the end, the disappointment for this game, for me, stacks up so much that I think that, you could argue that this time last year, back in 2016, I would argue that I'm kind of done with Final Fantasy.
Sure.
I've really been done with Final Fantasy for a long time. And I keep hoping that the shred of people that they have left to go after these games and to build them are actually meaningful. But I just don't think they're there. I think they're trying too hard. I think they probably put, no doubt they have beautiful animators. Sure. They have beautiful... the technical capability of Square Enix is it's unparalleled by almost any other game developer, save maybe like a Naughty Dog or a handful of others. And it's unfortunate because for all the beauty in these games and what they can put out, it just, the rest of the real core part of the game, like for me, the mechanics drove me nuts. I hated the battle system. I hated the repetitiveness of some of that stuff. For you, the story, I don't know. I think it's got to chalk up to an overall disappointment.
Well, let me ask you, so let's transition into another game that I just tweeted about recently. So everybody who's listened to this show for any length of time knows I am a huge Fire Emblem fan. Mm-hmm. And so they just released Fire Emblem Echoes, which is basically I'll call it a reimagining, but it's more a remaster of Fire Emblem 2, which was one of the more controversial games. It was the most off the beaten path one they'd ever produced. And so they gave this the full 3DS treatment, brought it up to modern standards. And I will tell you, this is the best looking one in terms of the battle animations. They had some really innovative ideas that now that I've seen the light and seen what they could do with it, the promotion system, the way that items level up. It's actually the best in the series ever.
And there's no waifu
legitimately
content,
ever. Don't go that. A little bit of waifu.
Okay.
Little bit of waifu.
Do you have to blow into the 3DS?
Luckily, they did remove that feature
God.
from the game.
Good.
But they added something that was kind of there in Fire Emblem 8, which is one of my favorites. But it was kind of like a branching storyline where you have two different sets of characters on the map, but you can control either of them and advance the story on either side. So it was cool in that you could have this back and forth element, but you could control the story at your own pace. And so while they added a bunch of great stuff, it's funny because you mentioned in Final Fantasy 15 the Iron Giants that come down from nowhere and spew enemies. They added these units in the game called caster units that basically every turn endlessly spam waves of enemies that are basically just garbage mobs that normally in a Fire Emblem game you would welcome because you'd say, great, if I can beat up these enemies, I just get XP and I can level up and I can get to my promotions faster. Like, you want enemies. But in this game, not only do they spam enemies, but they have the numbers so screwed up that you don't gain sufficient experience. So it's not even worth your time to kill the enemies.
Wow.
And so it's basically, it just doubles the length of every map. You have enemies. One of the core fundamentals of Fire Emblem is unit positioning. And, okay, I'm going to put my heavy armor unit up front to soak up damage while the mages can have ranged attacks. Well, no, I'm just going to break all that up because I'm going to allow some units to teleport behind your lines from anywhere on the map and just one-shot you from nowhere.
Oh, my
and so
God.
I'm playing this and saying, this is a game where one of the options is if your unit dies, it's permanently dead. And, oh, by the way, my underleveled units that I'm trying to protect, now I can just have enemies teleport behind and just crush that.
Oh, my gosh.
Opponent. I mean, it is literally game breaking to the point where I traded the game in and I just said, this is unplayable. I did rage sell it. And so what I'm torn by, Chris, and this is where I need your expert advice as a Nintendo Switch owner, I have made the statement and lived up to that promise. So when the Fire Emblem games, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn were released for GameCube and Wii, I literally only bought the Wii to play those two games. Now, I ended up playing other games, but literally if those would have been the only games I ever played on that system, I would have considered it money well spent and been fine with it. So Fire Emblem has been announced for the Switch, a new one, like next generation one.
Okay.
And it comes out in 2018. And this game, there have been 3 bad ones in a row in my mind. In terms of games where I say, looking back on them, I did not enjoy this. This is a step back for the franchise, even though I acknowledge that there are elements in all of those games that were improvements. And so this is an area as a fan, Chris, that I need some guidance from you. I have the money to buy a Switch. Look, it's not going to break the bank, but there's kind of that moral dilemma of, should I waste my money, especially when I'm not 100% sold that Intelligent Systems, the developer of this game, doesn't even know what they are doing anymore. I'm really gun-shy about giving this franchise yet another chance to buy another game that I'm not going to enjoy. But Chris, knowing my history with the franchise, what would you do in my predicament?
I don't know if I would buy a Switch specifically for Fire Emblem. I'd buy a Switch for other reasons or reason at this point. So, long story short, if you like Breath of the Wild and you think that's a game you can get into, I would definitely buy a Switch because I think it's worth. Breath of the Wild is one of those games that I will get so much time and gameplay. I've played that game hundreds of hours, even in the BCG mindset, right? Just hour here, hour there. And it's one of those games I can always turn on. I can play for 5 minutes. I can play for 4 hours. It doesn't matter. That has made the Switch super fun for me. Now, the Switch is lacking in a couple things until the fall when you get the Virtual Console kinds of things.
Right.
You get the online capability. I think Nintendo had backed out on that ridiculous idea about getting one game for 30 days. You get an access, if you pay, whatever, $4 or $5 a month, whatever it might be, you get access to a massive library. I think that's going to break it open and make it really fun to play. If you play games like Mario Kart 8, I just picked that game up for the Switch. I think that'll be great. If you have a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 of those games that are out now, probably not that many out now, or ones that are going to come out in the next 6 or 8 months, and I think it's probably worth it. And then you pick up Fire Emblem long term, and you don't feel like you've spent $360 on one game. But I mean, honestly, I do not think you can go wrong with Zelda if you want to do it in the interim, because they're only going to get harder to find as it gets closer to the end of the year. I'm sure it's going to be hard to grab one. It'll be a big holiday season gift. So.
And this is the dilemma I always come up with, in that you kind of feel this cumulative obligation to a franchise, right? You're so bought in. And I always tell people with Fire Emblem, and I think I have, there is a translated version for Fire Emblem fans that I know there's some of in the audience. You can actually get a functional GBA cart with the ROM English translated version of Fire Emblem 6, never released in the US, but people know it because people know Roy from Smash Brothers. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are some of the best games ever made in my mind. Certainly the best strategy games ever made. And so it's kind of like they've given me so much, and I feel
you don't owe them anything.
That's a helpful perspective, because I think our listeners, everybody's got varying viewpoints, and it's good to hear your viewpoint on this.
I don't really think. I mean, so it's to each their own, honestly. I think like Castlevania, Metroid. So Metroid's a good example, right? I will buy the next Metroid game. Period.
End of story.
But the latest Metroid game, Other M, I haven't played it, but people told me you just don't want to melt your brain even turning that game on. So, I mean, I do have the game, unfortunately, but so I think that you don't owe it to them, but I think it's a discussion. It's a kind of a internal reflection thing that everyone has to do with themselves. You don't buy it because you feel like you owe it to them. You buy it, like, for example, I did buy I Am Setsuna because I thought it would be really good, and I also want to encourage Tokyo RPG Factory to do more games long term. I want to show them that there is an audience for these games. And I do that largely with indie games and their smaller, cheaper games. $60 games, I don't do it. I like I said, I will. Of course, I've said this before. I wouldn't buy a Switch, and I did, and that happens too. But I didn't buy the Switch because I felt like Nintendo's given me all this fun with the Super NES and the NES, and I feel some sort of odd kindred spirits with them. I feel like I should help them. In many senses, it's a consumer-driven marketplace, and you're only really as good as what you've done for me lately.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think it's one of those things where it's not a foregone conclusion. You have to come to the decision whether there's something or someone or some idea or some notion that you want to, like, for example, in Fire Emblem Echoes, if this is a game that maybe it's terrible, but you have faith in the dev team or the director or the people that wrote the story or the translator, the localization people, 8.4 I did the localization of this thing, and I really like 8.4. So I was actually thinking about buying it before we had this discussion on the cast. So
dialogue's actually translation good, dialogue terrible.
And that's the thing, you might make the decision to buy the game because it's cheap and because you do want to continue to see a company like 8.4 continue to do good work long term. But you certainly don't. They certainly don't. You don't owe them anything.
That's a good perspective. So another one, Chris, that I think you're familiar with, that I read the publicity at the time. I'll put 2 games in this category, actually, that come to mind. No Man's Sky and Spore. These were games that literally promised to do everything, including cure cancer and make you a sandwich while you play the game. And by and large came out and people said, where's the content? Where's the fun? I don't get it. I've been building up so much hype for this game. It was just kind of like the expectations were already so unrealistic going in that you knew it would only disappoint relative to those expectations. But then it also disappointed relative to people that had no expectations going in.
Oh my gosh. It's funny. No Man's Sky was a game that I actually wasn't engaged in the hype marketing train that the gentleman was doing. I can't recall his name. He was talking about all the amazing things that were going to be in the game that ultimately were not. But I looked at the trailer, I looked at what was available, and I looked at what people were saying was actually in the game, and it seemed really interesting to me. The funny thing is, though, when I went to go look at it, this is actually, obviously what spurred one of our conversations, our episodes last year on returning games and whether you should be able to do that. I did not buy that game because I just felt like it was too controversial, it was too hot to touch, and I understand they're getting a little bit better here, but you think about disappointing games. I mean, that is the quintessential, the pinnacle, if you will, of disappointment in the last 10 years. I think has come from No Man's Sky. I'd say the only caveat would be a Duke Nukem game or something like that. But yeah, I mean, another one. We talked about a couple more of these. Spore, I'm not super familiar with Spore, but I know it had a very similar kind of story. Maybe not as dramatic of a crash as No Man's Sky.
Well, it was Game of the Year or Game of the Show at E3, I think, multiple years in a row. I mean, it was just fever pitch over this game. Obviously, you got Will Wright, really seasoned developer that everybody's got a lot of faith in. And the game was just garbage. I mean, it's just really, there was nothing there. There were people at the time who kind of tried to justify, this part's good, this part's good. But it's not a good game. It's not a game that anybody would ever go back and play for any reason. And it's tough, though, because he, as a developer, I mean, obviously, it doesn't undercut his prowess as a developer. I mean, the guy made SimCity. There's a lot of great games that have spawned from that. And you always struggle with okay, well, maybe this one was a dud, but what if they're one game away from reliving the magic and having that hit? Okay, there must have been something specific about this project that made it tank. And you kind of rationalize a way to say, okay, I need to protect this game so that they fund the next one. And I do struggle with that. I know, talking to some of our listeners, I know they do as well. When do you just say enough is enough and stop making bad games? And I'm not going to. If you make a good game, then we'll talk. But I'm not going to support your garbage endeavor or the fact that you couldn't rein in the scope of this to make a decent game.
What have you done for me lately? And it really underscores the fact that it's really not just one person. It's really the development team. It's really the entire package that really helps make a good game. And actually, a couple more that I want to bring up that I think are one of them. Was a complete disappointment as a game, and one of them was a disappointment that it didn't actually come to fruition. The former is actually a game that many of us who have been looking at Kickstarter have been watching for many years, called Mighty Number 9. If you're unfamiliar, Mighty Number 9 was actually Keiji Inafune, who is I guess one of the primary artists, the quote-unquote father of Mega Man, had left Capcom many years past and had basically made this pitch on Kickstarter that he was going to kind of not do necessarily, you have to be very careful how you say it, but wasn't really cloning Mega Man, but essentially he was making a Mega Man clone. Something that was just different enough that had a number of different features like a speedrunning mode and all these kinds of things. And so the Kickstarter blew up like many times over. I think he took too much money. He had too many stretch goals for, every possible freaking console from like original Game Boy to the Ouya or whatever. I'm exaggerating. But, he did all these things, and the game was just resoundingly a flop in the end. Like it took forever to come out. It was delay after delay after delay that left him sending these emails to the backers saying like, oh, the net code's not working for the multiplayer or whatever it might be, so we're going to delay the entire game. And it didn't really sound right to us, and to me either necessarily. So when it came out, it became a massive flop. And I think that's one of the things we talked about. One of the biggest chances for disappointment, I think, game over game, is a second or certainly a third iteration in a series.
Sure. And
granted, Mighty Number 9 is not a Mega Man, but you would expect the core kind of team, or at least one particular mind that comes from that Mega Man franchise, to be able to make something that you can break away from some of the things that Mega Man didn't do very well, and you could emphasize those points, fix those areas, and then kind of break out of that shell a little bit.
There's been enough history of what works, what doesn't, what people like, what people don't, to say, if I'm going to make that game, but I'm going to change this, and this, you'd think somebody would get that right.
Right, and you'd think, it's actually, it was such a missed opportunity, specifically this one, because, there were some things that Mega Man, you couldn't do anything differently, or anything too different from Mega Man or Mega Man X, and really, for certain, win over a crowd. I think, honestly, the transition between NES Mega Man and Mega Man X in a Super Nintendo, that difference between the two characters and the way the games play, despite the fact that their core is very similar, the games are very different.
Yeah, the charge shot changed a lot.
Yeah, and they took, and they really took, that and just like sprinting and things like that, bashing. A lot of that was very it took a big risk, I think, and you couldn't do that now with many of these types of games. And so that leads me into the next one I want to mention. This is one of the ones that I'm frankly pretty sad about, because you have back in the early days, the MMOs, we talked about this at the time, like one of the biggest MMOs, the first ones of its kind was Ultima Online. I played UO so many years, I loved it. But one of the ones that many of us, I think that, a lot of us played UO. I'd say majority of people didn't play UO in the end. Their first real MMO was EverQuest.
Right.
And, it's really fun because EverQuest has kind of come back now. Daybreak Games, I think, it bought the IP and is now running servers and all that. And it's really cool to see. But what was really sad about that was not only they did EverQuest 1, which was great. EverQuest 2, which was arguably kind of a mixture between WoW and old EverQuest. It kind of started to dilute the series a little bit. But EverQuest Next was really the thing that I thought was really interesting.
I remember that.
They had so much potential in that game. And granted, it was lofty. And granted, we hadn't really heard a lot from Daybreak. They've done a lot of things more recently. But back in the day, a couple of years ago, they hadn't really done a lot as far as I was concerned. But, you really hope that game could turn into something nice. And, of course, it was summarily completely canned.
Right. And
it's gone. So I think that's another case where I was disappointed, not in the game and what it actually did, but I was disappointed in the fact that here we were, they took enough time, and I'm sure it was kind of for an IP licensing related kind of thing, but there was a lot of time between EverQuest 2 and 1, and then there was this reimagining of EverQuest Next. And I thought that gave us enough time, it gave the team enough time to really come back and say, here's how we make the next step in this, the next, I guess, iterative step in this game that has some revolutionary components, but it's also evolutionary in many ways, so you don't feel too far stepped out of what the original EverQuest did, but you still have more of a modern take on things, and it was sad to see that one go for sure.
Sure. So Chris, let's transition to, let's say the game, it's not just a disappointment in concept or what they put in the game versus what you were expecting. Let's just say they ship you a game and it flat just doesn't work like you expect a game to. The performance issues are really a big factor in the game, and it just really tarnishes the overall experience. So let me lead with a game that I've talked about on the show a little bit before, but Bayonetta is one of the best character action games. I mean, depending on what day you ask me, it is probably my favorite character action game. It just felt phenomenal to play that game, and the move sets were cool, the weapons were cool, the scaling difficulties as you'd go through those, excellent. The PS3 version of the game is awful. It didn't work. It is really just shameful, and I'm honestly, I would, at the time, and I wrote a review on the game, I just said, everybody at Sega of America that has now, I think, since been disbanded, deservedly so, not targeting any individual, but they should be ashamed of themselves for shipping a product like that. That is something where, as a company, Sega has a history and integrity to protect, and to ship a product like that is really just inexcusable to your fans. But it just made the game that I loved so much, it just made it unplayable, and I couldn't keep the PS3 version, even though that was my preferred console. And it was really tough to cope with. And what I have since learned, and I own this, but I've not had a chance to play it yet, to experience it, is many years later, I can't even remember what year Bayonetta came out, but many, many years ago at this point, they have since re-released it for PC. And from everything I have read, again, I've read it enough to actually purchase it sight unseen, but they basically said, take the Xbox version and make it way better than that. And it's smooth, it runs better, all of the content is just, it's a little bit better than even the best version of the game.
Wow.
And so it's like the game that was such it was like the swan that had its feather ripped off. So it's just enough where you're like, oh, this thing's gross. I don't want to look at this anymore. They finally, all these years later, they realized there was so much fan excitement over the game that they did the right thing. And they said, no, we're going to release the definitive version of the game you wanted to play. We're not going to make you buy a Wii U to play Bayonetta 2. We're going to give you the game you always wanted, and we're going to give you the best version of it. And I feel like this is an example of what could happen in a game where there's enough traction and there's enough of a voice in the community that that people can right a wrong. It's not like the old days with the cartridge-based games where you release a cartridge-based game, all the data's on there. If you want the fixed version of the game, you better hope that there's enough people clamoring for a re-release because there's no way to deal with it within the game itself. And I think that Bayonetta honestly is an example of a game that gives me hope. That tells me, okay, people notice these flaws, and maybe they actually are listening. At times you feel like these.
Maybe, yeah.
On my worst day, I will sit on the couch, as I did with Fire Emblem Echoes, and just shake my fist and say, what did they not get about their own franchise? Like, why did they think this would be fun? Why did they not think this would ruin the game? And I just honestly find myself getting frustrated at times with some of these things, these decisions developers make, and then you go back and you say, are they even listening to any of the feedback? Are they just making this in a vacuum? But when I see the Bayonetta PC version, it just gives me hope in humanity that there is somebody listening out there that is in a position to give you what you wanted all along and do something about it.
Well, you know what we have to do? We have to create business casual gamers games.
Yes.
The studio.
This is true. Right the wrongs of the past.
And we will right the wrongs of the past, and I'm sure all of our lovely fans will do nothing but buy our copies of games, regardless of whether they like it or not, and we will be filthy rich. No,
so Chris, another one that I know that is near and dear to your heart, one more so than another, but all of the Bethesda games. So you were a big Elder Scrolls fan. You were the first one that showed me Elder Scrolls. I've played Fallout as well. You've played a different version of Fallout, but talk me through some of your experiences working your way through the beautiful faces that are presented in every Bethesda game.
Well, it's funny because I don't fault them for creating these amazing engines because Elder Scrolls has been doing this for years, like Morrowind and all the ones, not even just Skyrim, the one that we kind of remember the most, and Fallout 4. They've had these engines for many, many years, and they are incredibly, I'd say, rival to things like a Grand Theft Auto and a Rockstar or whatever.
Sure.
Even the Rockstar, honestly, those are very open worlds, and you have a lot of interactivity. But I think the Bethesda games are much, much more, I guess, open. You can interact with everything. You can pick up anything. Everything has weight. All sorts of things that are in there. That is. I want to just start by saying that it was really cool that they undertook that kind of an effort and an endeavor, and it's probably why they haven't really. Why I'm complaining about it now is because they built it as its core, and I'm sure they haven't really refined it all that much over the last iterations of all these games. But yeah, so when you play any one of these games, Skyrim is certainly like this. The Fallout games, Fallout 4 is actually like this as well. They're just so buggy. I mean. So buggy, and I think it's tied back to the massive amount of different instances of how things can go wrong.
Oh yeah,
like
there's
when you have
competing things that say, "Oh, I didn't know those two things were going to interact."
You have 1,000 different characters that are autonomous in a sense, and you have all these enemies that are kind of autonomous as well, and and that is. That's really cool in a sense, and to some sense, Breath of the Wild did the same kind of thing. I think Breath of the Wild did it a lot better in that you can set fire to the grass, and then the enemy can run through grass and can hurt them just like it can hurt you. You can do those kinds of things, maybe not to that extent in Bethesda games, but the problem was that you have these weird buggy issues where I know in Fallout 4, for example, I think I might have mentioned it maybe a year ago. That I had this one quest seeker who I had completed a quest. I needed to go back to the quest guy, and he wasn't talking to me. And, you search on Google, and you find, oh, yeah, this is a known issue. Just kind of run around for a little bit, and eventually he'll talk to you. Or reset the game, eventually it'll happen. Well, I did all those things. Nothing happened. But eventually, I don't know why, but eventually he spoke to me again, and I could move the game forward. And, those are kinds of things that are... For a simulation in a sense, and there are many cases you could argue this is somewhat of a simulation, this world, it is so encompassing and so interesting, but it is so, it rips you out of the world faster than anything I've ever seen to have those kinds of events occur. And to your point about the teleporting guys, when you have enemies that can see you through walls, that can shoot through walls or grab you through walls or things like that because of the freedom involved in this environment can kind of cheat the way your expectations for how the world works from a physical perspective or even from a psychological perspective, it really does hurt the game. And this is one of the ones that just killed me The games are really fun, and I do think that you should play them, especially Skyrim. I really love Skyrim, but I got so used, Skyrim, of course, we talked about the loading times many episodes ago, but loading times are absolutely terrible in the game. And combined with the fact that bugs meant you died a lot and bugs meant that you reset a lot, it just exacerbated that problem of load time. And so the game itself was great, but I still have to dock at a couple points in the end where you just can't. It's not really playable in a sense.
One of the things, and I'll contrast this to another game before we move to our next area. One of the things that is interesting about a game like that, when you have so many, just the fundamental design of the game makes it very hard to address all the potential problems. Because let's just say that one quest giver, you say, oh, hey, we found the glitch or the thing in the code that is causing that. Mm-hmm. You kind of start playing whack-a-mole and you say, okay, we'll address that problem. But then once you get past that quest, you find a million other things that could go wrong.
Right.
But take a smaller scale game. One that I bought recently was the Silent Hill HD collection. So I've mentioned Silent Hill 2 on the show, but this is basically a repackaging and an HD upres of Silent Hill 2, which is the best in the series, and Silent Hill 3, which is the next best in the series. And this was, these are two games that I want in my collection. And I've talked a lot that I want to own the best version of games. Mm-hmm. And when this was released, it should have been just, I would say, a very simple product that, hey, just make it look better. But it had some really game-breaking stuff. Characters getting caught in the floor, just basic nonsense stuff.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because Silent Hill 2 especially is a game where it has a cult following. People were furious about this. And this is a franchise that is still moderately active where they're going to try and sell the next Silent Hill at some point. And if you just lost your fan base because they abandoned ship because you sold them a piece of garbage product on this, what should have been a simple re-release, you're basically killing yourself for any potential sales of the next game. And to their credit, they came back and they released a very comprehensive patch that addressed from everything I have understood. Now, I haven't played through it yet, but people have basically said, as long as you have the patch, there may be a time or two where you find something and you restart, like just reset the game and it works. But you won't find anything game-breaking at this point. And some of them were saying, I've played through the game successfully the entire time. It's still a shame that any of this stuff was in the game at all, but they made it right. All the stuff that should have been done the first time was done ultimately. And so I look at that as an example of when the community comes together and really points out in writing, here are the specific problems I'm experiencing, so that you're almost like an extended bug tester for the developer.
Right. And
you put it out there and you have a loyal fan base that's willing to kind of band together and do this. I think the encouraging thing about where we are as a community at this point is that you can get developer action in certain cases. Now, maybe
you're right.
Patching an Elder Scrolls is a little bit more of a chore. That would be a very long development cycle. But for some of these smaller scale games where you just say, it would be great, but for this, that can get fixed. And that does give me hope that we can address this and the initial sadness can be cured.
Well, I think, you're right. They're when they assign some monetary value to the losses or expected losses they're going to get by, like you mentioned, future games, not only just this one, of course it becomes a big issue. And I think that, it's funny, I'm just thinking about as you're talking through these things, I'm thinking about how there are some of these games in the future or in the past that I've played where maybe it's like a quest where someone's following me or something's going to happen. And knowing that the game is buggy in certain areas, you're like, well, I'm going to take the long way around this thing, or I'm going to go really slow here because I don't want to take the chance that something's going to screw up and I'm going to have to redo this part again. And that's, that more than anything is it devolves the game. Number one, it separates you from it. You break that wall, and now you're trying to figure out how to outsmart the software as opposed to being encompassed and engrossed in this game and the story and trying to complete that. You're like, okay, well, I want to complete the level. I want to complete the quest. I want to get to this next area. How can I make sure that this game, this fragile little snowflake of the game, stays up and running long enough for me to get where I want to go and hit that save point or move the story forward? And that's something that I think that is, it's unfortunate. And I think I understand why games like this are, do have bugs, but we've seen examples things like Witcher 3, I keep bringing that up. Witcher 3 is an example of a very open world that, granted, maybe to your point, didn't start completely perfect, but was quickly patched and turned into a really solid open world game that has a lot of freedom that isn't quite as snowflakey as some of the Bethesda titles.
Absolutely. So Chris, let's go into our final portion of this segment. What about, hey, the game's fine, it's cool, they got the execution right, it works, but maybe I'm just not good enough at this game to the point where I'm not progressing, or all the cool stuff that's built into the game. I just realized that I am probably never going to devote the time to experience what the game has to offer.
Well, wait. Let's stop there first, because this is certainly something that it's foreign to us completely. We're pretty pro gamers here, okay? We're pretty okay. Just make sure you don't ever watch any of the retro reruns. You'll just believe the narrative that we are excellent pro gamers. But you're right. If that were to be the case, hypothetically speaking,
if I know a guy,
I might know a friend. And the friend, very similarly, has problems with this, whether it's a game that they just prefer not to play, it's too hard, or they want to see it play better, whatever. We're going to go to Twitch or YouTube for a lot of those things, I think. I mean, you're going to go to, and I think that's a lot of reasons why, and we've talked in the past about how Twitch appeals to a lot of different random people, and people, outside of the gaming community can look at Twitch and be like, wait a minute, wait. People are watching people play games, and moreover, people are paying to watch people play games. Doesn't make sense. But when you combine, the BCG mindset stuff we've talked about in the past with what you're talking about now, with maybe I don't want to, it's an MMO and I don't want to sit there for like 26 hours and be the first to the highest level, or I don't want to see this raid boss. I don't want to have to put in the hours to learn this raid boss. I'm just going to watch, someone do this, and I'm going to, live vicariously through them on Twitch or on YouTube. I think that's certainly. Well, I do it, right? I think that's a valid piece, especially from a BCG perspective.
Well, let's take a game that we've both been talking about. So, Chris, you actually played as one of your assignments Overwatch, and I picked up the game recently, and we're making some time to play. And certainly, if any listeners are into this, we'll put it out there. We're going to be online playing at some point, and we'd certainly love for you to join. But this is a game where you look at the fact that, A, I'm getting into the game at a point in time where a lot of time has passed since release, and a lot of people are very good at the game now. And B, even let's say if I were to commit myself to say, oh, okay, I'm going to play this over a long period of time, and eventually the curve flattens out and I'll catch up. The reality is I'm not going to spend that much time playing the game, meaning I'm not going to play it every night. I'm going to play it maybe once a week if I love the game, and for not huge amounts of time. I may not even by the end of it. I mean, you get people that know the matchups and can swap characters mid-match and all this stuff to say, oh, this is the right unit against this. I'm not even likely to play all the characters by the time I'm done with this game. I mean, it's seriously, that is a real possibility. And so I look at that and I say, well, I could go two ways about this. I could either say, well, this game's not for me, and just completely sit on the sidelines. Or I could just say, you know what? The way I'm going to approach this game is I'm going to have fun playing on noob mode and just kind of messing around, doing the best I can, trying to kind of play my character's role to the best of my ability and see some cool stuff and have some fun. And then supplement that with, if I want to watch the high-skilled players and maybe pick up a thing or two along the way, but really just see high-level play and what's possible with the game. Exactly what you said. Look on Twitch, look on YouTube, watch replays of the game, enjoy the commentary that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really great way to enjoy some of the best games. It's like the developer, they get my money. I rewarded them for releasing a game that I'm having fun with. But I'm going to limit my involvement to the point where I just say I'm not willing to put more time into it, but I'm just going to use the time to the best of my ability based on what's available, which is a combination of playing the game and watching the game at the highest possible skill level. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There are so many different aspects to it that I think are very valuable. I mean, the StarCraft 2 thing we talked about a long time ago was really cool because I'm not going to be the guy with 200 or 400 APM. It makes my hands hurt to make this thing happen, but I will watch someone play StarCraft 2 potentially. And you're right. I think there are a lot of aspects to it. What I typically said, I said before when it comes to Twitch, for me, it's less about if it's a game that I know up front that I won't play. So here's an example. The latest Resident Evil.
I will eventually come around to that game, but I have the PSVR, and I want to play it in PSVR. People say it is scary as all get out, and I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm really ready for that game, honestly. So I've watched some of this game be played on Twitch, and it's not for me yet. I may eventually, through looking at some of the first little bits of the game, maybe it'll entice me to continue playing, or maybe there's another reason why I might buy it. But in the end, I typically, when I look at games like indie games, I watch Twitch for a little bit, and I say, oh, this is a game. Actually, Dead Cells, that we're going to talk about in a moment, is a perfect example of a game I saw Code Carnage play, and I was like, oh, what's this game? This is kind of cool. And then, I'd be interested in this thing, and we started talking, and it became, an assignment. And that's a thing where I think, for a game like Dead Cells, it doesn't really matter, because we'll get into some reasons why, but for games that are narrative-driven, like 3-4 Home, things like that, what I've heard I've talked about in the past. Those are games where I might watch 5 or 10 minutes of it and realize this is a game I want, and I'll turn it off and I'll go play the game later. So I kind of use it as a filtering function because we talked about this. Business casual gamers, all of us listening, don't have a lot of time to play every single game out there. And in this particular scenario, I can't afford to have a game let me down.
Right.
I can't afford to, in many cases, to things that we've talked about in the past, the game could be absolutely great. Like Fire Emblem is getting good reviews, I think.
Ish.
I've heard a lot of people talk about how fun of a game it is, and then you don't like it. So, I mean, that's a good case for, understanding what parts of the game might appeal and might not appeal to you would be very interesting going into it. And so that's why it's for me personally, it's less of this game is too hard. This is more along the time of, I'm not going to invest that time, or I'm going to make sure that the time I invest is valuable. So I'm going to watch, in the world of no demos, we talked again, another topic we've talked about in the past, no demos. Let me go watch this on Twitch for a little bit and kind of get that demo experience and kind of whet my appetite here and see if I bite on it.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great place to wrap up. So we'd love to hear from you, the audience. What do you think about this topic? I mean, we've talked about both some disappointing aspects of experiences with games where we're still honestly in the middle of trying to figure out how to cope with that and how to move forward. And also giving you hopefully some ideas of when you have that disappointing experience, maybe what good can come out of it and what are some ways to approach that. So we'd love to hear from you, maybe some of your most disappointing experiences, and maybe you can answer some of the questions we have posed to each other on this show. But with that, we're going to move into our assignments because I really want to hear about this game. So Chris, we assigned you Dead Cells for the PC. Now, this is, as we mentioned on the last episode, it's a combination of one genre that I'd say I know you like, and another one that we've kind of had you dabble in over the past year that I'm figuring out whether you like, which is a combination of the Metroidvania formula, which I know you like, and the roguelike aspect of it, which I'm still kind of figuring out, hey, are we, and we may explore that in a future episode a little bit more depth, but what did you think of this game? Give me your overall impressions, and I've got some more pointed questions.
Yeah, of course. I just can't quit those roguelikes. It's funny. So first of all, before I get into it, let me just say, at the time of this particular review or play session for me, this game is in early access on Steam. So it was available. It was early access, and it looked cool to me. The game is certainly playable, so I don't even have anything negative to say about it. So I don't know, but just notice the game may change here and there, maybe get better, may potentially get worse in some areas. But keep that in mind as we talk a little bit about it. And so, yeah, it is an interesting combination of that Metroidvania and a roguelike. And what I mean by that is, you've got a lot of exploratory components to the game where you've got a level and you've got various levels with maps, and you kind of go through those maps to explore different nooks and crannies of the area. You collect secrets and items. Getting those items and those kinds of things, the exploration is a big piece of it. True to form on the roguelike side, it is excruciatingly hard in some areas. Now, when you first start, you're going to die a lot, I think, or I did. And as with many other roguelikes, you slowly start to understand how enemies move and how they kind of want you to control things and how you want to dodge. And you'll get a little bit better at it. But, again, it has very, very quick deaths, at least early on. Certainly long term, you're going to die a lot, and you have a single life. So, true to roguelike fashion, you start your game, you collect some items, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. you inevitably will die and you start over again from scratch. And so the idea here is, I don't know a lot about the backstory necessarily, but I think you are a glob of cells who like reanimate this character.
Okay.
And you move through this, as I mentioned, explore through these sewer areas and some other areas in hopes of beating bosses, collecting items, and kind of helping yourself on your way. And one thing that I think that's so cool about it is there are a number of slots that you can use for items. There are kind of there's one that's a weapon, primary weapon, which can be a whip, it can be daggers, it can be swords, all sorts of things. You have a necklace or kind of a choker kind of thing you can wear, which is more of a passive effect, like damage reduction, for example. Then you have some kind of ancillary items like a bear trap, or you have bombs or stun grenade kinds of things you can do, which I think is really fun as well. And you also have another piece, which is kind of I'll call it a secondary weapon slot, which is true. But it can be things from like a bow and arrow. It could be maybe a shield and whatnot. And so the cool part about it is, as you go through and play each level, and as you end up dying, you're going to collect more and more of these kinds of items, kind of like a Binding of Isaac, or we've talked a little about Enter the Gungeon as well. And those items are kind of quote unquote unlocked now, and they are open to be seen again in subsequent playthroughs.
Okay.
So what you start learning is you might start early on with a shield, and you say, okay, I'm going to kind of figure out how to use this shield, and it might be nice. And then maybe you'll, like for me, I ran with a shield for a little while, and I used a shield to kind of help stop enemies who were charging at me or jumping at me. And then quickly I found a stun grenade. And once I found the stun grenade, in combination with, say, I think I had an actual bomb, I started getting into a groove, and it was really, really fun. So this exploration, you approach these different these different levels, or different, I don't mean levels as in level 1, level 2, but as in like platform levels.
Okay.
You're making your way through these platform levels, and enemies are surprisingly very good at noticing you, either from below or from above. And so they will throw projectiles at you. They'll situate themselves relatively close to you in ways that make it a little bit harder for you to attack them. And so you kind of have to use your brain to figure out how best do you get down there and whittle these enemies down without dying. Because in many cases, unlike many games in the past, you think about like a Streets of Rage, for example, where you might have 5 enemies on the scene, or 4 enemies, you can kind of reasonably fight 1 or 2 at a time. And the others, they don't necessarily hold back, but they also aren't fast enough to come up and engage you.
It's like all the people in a martial arts movie where you have 20 people surrounding and only 2 at a time are allowed to fight. Yeah.
So it's not like that. If you have 5 enemies on the screen, all 5 enemies are going full bore against you at all times. Okay. And so that's rare. But what you have to think about is, you might have one particular ground enemy that has, like when you kill them, they drop these explosive things that will like just eat your life away. You might have another one that shoots a projectile that kind of like a goo that sticks to you and does damage over time. And then you also might have another one that, like a zombie thing, that jumps at you aggressively, and if it hits you, it's basically game over. You're going to die unless you've really pumped up your skills, your stats. And so those kinds of things are kind of interesting. And as you start playing, you learn, how to kind of have that timer in the back of your head that, this guy's about to jump, I need to do a roll attack, or I need to roll away, and this guy's going to drop stuff, so I need to, kind of plan this thing out. And I really think that it reminded me a lot of Spelunky, a very fast Spelunky, if you played that. Spelunky is very, again, it's kind of gonna adventurous kind of thing, go out and figure out how to collect items and all of that, and every little thing can kill you. There are less traps, I'd say, in Dead Cells that I found, but it is certainly more, I think it's more appealing long term. There's more to gain from it. You gain money, and money allows you to go out and buy more weapons and more pieces of armor, or things that I talked about. There's another system called cells that you collect, and of course it's called Dead Cells, so I guess you collect these dead cells from enemies. And at the end of every quote-unquote stage, in a sense, you can use those cells towards... You have to spend them all every time you see the particular vendor. You have to put them towards something. But you put them towards things like... for example, I used them for a potion that gives me life. And so in a game like this, in my mind, where you can die really quickly, where you don't really have any opportunities in the middle of a level to gain more life... You can use this particular thing, this particular life piece to get you some extra life when you really, really need it, because you're going to be making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
So I think all in all, I mean, the game is super fun. I haven't gotten too far in it, and I don't know if it's actually, I don't think it's actually, well, certainly not complete, but I don't know if there are more levels beyond the 2 or 3 that I played. But it is certainly a game that I highly recommend because it's relatively cheap, number one. It is a really unique aspect, kind of conglomeration between, the Metroidvania and the roguelike. And, despite the fact that as we mentioned, roguelikes are kind of this thing where I tend to get very frustrated with them very quickly because I die so much initially. Like, I had the same thing about Enter the Gungeon, the same problem. It's hard as heck, and I know people get through it faster than I do, but I still want to come back and play. I still have the urge to give it a go. That might be due largely to the fact that giving it a go might mean I'm playing for 5 or 6 minutes versus like an hour, but it is certainly something I would recommend.
Well, let me ask you this. So the part of the game, I'm much like you, the part that appeals to me is more the Metroidvania aspect. I'm not somebody that's really deep into roguelikes. If you were just to say, I'm going to put up with the game knowing that it's difficult, is the Metroidvania influence strong enough in the game where you think that somebody like me who says, not a huge roguelike person, but I'll put up with it if the Metroidvania part's good enough, is that enough of a draw to the game to bring the Metroidvania crowd along? Or do you have to like both parts of the equation, so to speak? I
would hazard a guess to say that the roguelike is the predominant or the preeminent piece of this game. So if you're so on roguelikes, you probably you have to come around to roguelikes to enjoy this game, in my mind. Okay. Because the core pieces of a Metroidvania, this game looks like a Metroidvania. It plays like one as well. And if you're good at roguelikes, then you're gonna get something out of it. But I think that what you won't get out of it, unfortunately, is there's not a lot of leveling necessarily. You're not going to feel like you're progressing all that much because you will be dying a lot. And the game is just tuned to be very punishing in many areas. Because it's, many of these roguelikes, and again, this one's not done, so I don't know, but games like Enter the Gungeon, you could beat that game in like 10 minutes if you really plow through it and you go fast. And so with that, in order to make sure they balance it and they tune it correctly, they have to make it very punishing in certain areas. And so this is the same kind of thing. There are better games to play if you want a Metroidvania game. But if you love roguelikes and you also like the ability to like go out and kind of collect some items and get some skills and all those kinds of things, I think this is a game worth playing. And certainly at the price point. I mean, again, we're talking indie games here. The price point here is exceptional for what you get.
If I had, since we've talked about these fairly recently, if you had to play one game between Enter the Gungeon and this game, which one would you pick and why?
That's a really good question. I mean, I like them both for different reasons. I think that Enter the Gungeon probably would win out for me, largely just because it's a very close call. The reasons I would go for Enter the Gungeon is because I kind of like that top-down exploration kind of a roguelike, kind of like a Binding of Isaac in a sense, and just for the fact that it's so darn unique and creative. I mean, everything has something to do with a gun or powder or whatever, right? And the style and the essence of that game is pretty darn cool. That said, though, Dead Cells is right up there. If you like a side-scrolling kind of game and you like more of a... I'd say there's more exploration in Enter the Gungeon. You open a door in a room. You don't know what is in the room until you go in through that door, and then it lights up. And yes, there are secrets, but you kind of explored that room, and you just go from room to room to room. In Dead Cells, you have to kind of look at the mini map and see where you haven't explored, and there are certain little finger tangents to that map that you have to find. If you really want to explore everything. And I think that's really where a lot of the value in exploration comes in. So if you like those kinds of things and you tend to like the side-scroller, I'd recommend Dead Cells. Otherwise, I do think Gungeon's probably a better choice.
How long before you kind of hit that first wall where you just said, okay, this game is... You knew going in, I think we all knew the genre, and we knew this was probably going to be on the more difficult side. But when did you hit that point where you said, okay, this game's not playing around. I'm going to have to get to its level, so to speak.
Like 5 minutes.
Okay. It's quick.
It's you and I'm not going to spoil anything necessarily. And these are enemies you can find, but I mentioned there's this enemy that jumps at you. These green enemies. And so I very quickly you're going to learn there are some archers and then there are green enemies. And so what I had done was I was trying to creep up on this archer, and I was kind of ducking, staying away from him initially because he was shooting his arrows. And what I thought would happen would be maybe the green guy wouldn't notice me, or maybe he'd just be slow to come at me or whatever, and I'd slowly make it up. But what actually happened was the green guy jumped at me and just basically one-shot me. And I was like, whoa, that's quick. And so, you learn that really quickly. Inside of 10 or 15 minutes, I got to what I can only think is a boss that reminds me of Dark Souls in a sense. You just have to kind of figure out. It's not quite as punishing, and it's not like you put 10 minutes in because the game decides that you need to fight this boss for 10 minutes. It's more along the lines of you have to learn all the little things that they do and the patterns they do and what you do in those patterns, and depending on where you were located and where you're situated and all that. And once you figure that out, you're going to die a lot of times. When you figure that out, you're going to make it through. The challenge there is I believe the levels seem to be randomly generated or something very similar, because you can't say you're going to find that boss again inside of 10 minutes. And there is that you have to get back to that point again to see that boss. So, it's not like you get to pound your head against them, every minute for 10 minutes straight until you've learned it all. You have to exercise those skills over a period of time.
Okay. So final question for me, knowing that this is going to be a bit of a slog, do you see yourself going back to finish this game?
I think so. I mean, honestly, I'll be honest. When I first started to play the game, actually, I played it the night. I was going to stream it, and I didn't get a chance. I just got too tired. But I did play the game the night of last episode after I posted the podcast. I played a little bit, and I was like, oh, what did I get into? This is just really punishing in a sense. And I don't know if I just wasn't. I do think that I haven't remapped the buttons, but the control schemes are a little bit awkward for me with Xbox One controller on a PC. I'm sure I could fix that by remapping things. I haven't tried, like I said, but I'm sure that would fix things. But there was just something about the control scheme and the interactions and the punishing nature of the game that really kind of turned it off for me. So I put it down. And I honestly, I didn't pick it back up for maybe... I played it a lot yesterday, obviously the day before we record, and maybe 2 days before that I played a little bit. But those 2 days were very instrumental, and that's when I mentioned earlier in my review that I kind of got the stun grenade, the grenade and the stun grenade, kind of get together, and things started jiving. For those 3 days, I was really enjoying it. And it's not the fact that I didn't always have that same combination, but I started learning how to do it. I started getting more fluid with how I could, I just started assessing very quickly how to take out big packs of enemies. I started getting a little bit more aggressive about jumping down, whacking something, killing it, and escaping as quickly as possible. And to reassess what's left as far as enemies in that area. And that really made it much more fun for me, because I tend to play games, if you've watched me play things, and maybe it comes out on retro reruns, but the speedrun nature of you can't take the speedrunner out of a person,
sure.
I think. And even games that are brand new to me that I know to be punishing, I still play them like I'm speedrunning them. I want to keep moving, got to keep going fast, and I tend to get frustrated quickly because I just plow through it. And some games demand that you stop and that you slow down. This is not one of them. This is one of the ones that you can learn. And I actually could foresee, assuming there's less randomness in there, I could foresee good speedruns of this game, because you can really start to learn how to piece things together and really tackle some of the challenges. And you start to learn ahead of time, even though it's kind of random, what would be interesting and challenging to, with respect to maybe you're jumping over a pit of poisonous gas or poisonous goo, and there's another flying enemy right next to you that's going to swoop in and try and kill you. You can see those kinds of things ahead of time, which really lets you be a little bit more, dynamic about how you play it.
Okay, well, for those of you who've been playing along, we'd love to hear your feedback on this game. It sounds like an interesting one, certainly one you're going to have to kind of buckle up and get ready for some challenge on. But Dead Cells for PC sounds like an interesting one. So, Chris, what do you have in store for me this week?
Yeah, so this will be a fun one. So, we've talked about this one before. We kind of gave a little bit of a hint last episode. I have played this before. I want to know what you think of The Last Guardian.
Okay.
And this is important because it kind of ties into the episode really well, honestly, because this is a game that took forever to create, that honestly many people, prior to October of last year,
I thought it was vaporware.
Never thought it was, thought it was vaporware, never going to come out. Now it's out. I've played it. You've played Eco and other games in the past, Shadow of the Colossus, I think, as well. I want to know what you think about this game and whether it ends up being a disappointment or if it ends up bucking the trend. Because typically when you think about games like this that have like Final Fantasy 15 kind of timelines, something went wrong along the way. Something went dramatically wrong. And this game started on PS3, released on PS4. I want to see what you think about it.
This one's going to be tough because I will say Shadow of the Colossus and Eco, some of my favorite games. I would put Shadow of the Colossus probably in my top 20 games of all time, and Eco in my top 50 probably. But I have not played I was so excited about this game. I watched all the trailers, and then as it started kind of further falling off the rails and feeling like it was vaporware, when it finally came out, and again, I haven't seen much of the game. I know what it's about, but the reviews were very average. And I just kind of, it was clear that the public really loved Eco and Shadow of the Colossus and was very meh about this game.
Easy Allies loved it.
Okay, and this is one where I'm glad that I'm playing this game because I have to know. I just do. And I feel like this is one where, prices clearly dropped to a point where the barrier to entry is not quite the same, and I got to know. So 2 weeks, we will know the answer.
I cannot wait for that. I think it's going to be really fun to hear your feedback on that game. And of course, you at home listening or watching, please, if you're interested, play The Last Guardian with Aaron. See what you think. Give us some feedback ahead of time. If you get it to us ahead of time, you know when we post every 2 weeks on a Thursday usually, or maybe a Friday if I'm feeling lazy. Get us your feedback at BIS Casual Gamers or email us. Do whatever you want to do. I'd love to be able to add some of those segments in there as well as we hear from Aaron and his perspective in the game. Now, with that, I think we're nearing the end of this particular episode here, but I want to remind you, check us out at businesscasualgamers.com. Please take the time to rate us on iTunes and other things. Please, it really, really means a lot to us. It's probably the hardest thing podcasters go through is trying to harp on getting these reviews. But we want to continue to expand the audience. And you've already done a great job of expanding the audience with your friends and family and folks you know personally. But I want to try and see if we can get people excited about this show and the BCG mindset outside of our personal connections. And the way we do that is by playing the game with the algorithms in iTunes and the like. A lot of that's based on ratings. So please take the time to rate us. Give us your feedback, what you like, what you don't like. We love that. Of course, check us out on Twitter at BS Casual Gamers. If you're watching us on YouTube, click the subscribe button. It really helps us as well, kind of figure out who's interested in what topic and what format, whether you like it in the audio version or you like that video version. And I promise, Aaron and I are promising, we will get back to putting some more video content on there, some more retro reruns.
There's lots of bad games left in the world to play.
Lots of bad games.
Lots of them.
Lots of more fun things for us to do, I think. The streaming of Overwatch, I think, is a really fun thing that we should be able to do. We're going to find out how to get that together so we can put that on Twitch TV. We can put that on YouTube. I think they'd be really fun BC Live segments. We've got a lot in store for you this year, and I'm really excited to continue going with it. And with that, we will say goodbye.
See you in 2 weeks.